She smiled every single morning from behind that anchor desk. Millions of people trusted that smile. They woke up to her voice, reached for their coffee, and believed, without question, in her composure. She felt familiar in the way that only truly public people can, like someone you knew without ever having met. But familiarity is not the same as truth, and there are things a camera simply cannot show. Savannah Guthrie built a life that looked, from the outside, like something assembled with great care. Career, family, faith, all of it visible, all of it seemingly in order. She had become one of the most recognized faces in American morning television. A lawyer who had crossed over into journalism, who had stood before presidents without blinking, who seemed to carry a kind of unshakable steadiness wherever she went. And then there was Michael Feldman, quieter, far less known, a man who existed largely outside the frame, by choice it seemed, and with considerable discipline. For years, the details of their relationship stayed tucked beneath the surface, not because there was nothing there, but because neither of them made it easy to find. Some things were revealed slowly, almost reluctantly, in the way that people share only what they've decided they can afford to. Others only surfaced after the questions were already being asked out loud. What kind of story gets quietly kept by two people who appear, on the surface, to have nothing to hide? That question matters more than it might seem, because when the pieces eventually come together, the timeline, the choices, the long stretches of silence, what emerges is not the story most people assumed they already knew. It is something more complicated, something more honest, something that doesn't resolve neatly and probably never will. There's a particular kind of pressure that comes with being trusted by millions of strangers. Before they've had their first cup of coffee, Savannah Guthrie understood that pressure, had lived inside it, in a way most people never will. She hadn't arrived at it through luck or timing or the right connections made at the right party. She had earned it slowly, through years of work that didn't always make it into the highlight reel. Before the Today Show, before the presidential debates and the White House press briefings, before her face became shorthand for morning news itself, there was a different version of her story, one that started in law school. She studied law, passed the bar, and only then made the pivot toward journalism. People who watched that transition happen have described it not as an escape from one career, but as a deepening of something she already had. She didn't leave her precision behind when she walked into a newsroom. She carried it with her, into every interview, every carefully worded question, every moment when she sat across from someone powerful and refused to let them off the hook. By the time she rose to co-anchor NBC's Today, she had become something genuinely rare in American media. Not cold, not untouchable, but grounded in a way that suggested she had already made peace with the particular chaos of live television and simply refused to be taken apart by it. Her personal life, during all of this, was quieter, or at least, it appeared that way. Before Michael Feldman, there had been someone else. A first marriage, reported and relatively brief, that ended before her career had fully reached its peak. She never spoke about it in any meaningful depth. She didn't use it as material or wrap it in the language of personal growth for an audience. It simply existed, like a closed chapter in a book that kept going. And when that chapter closed, Michael Feldman entered the next one. He came from political consulting, a background in Democratic politics, advising campaigns, moving through the back channels of Washington in the way that certain people in that world are specifically trained to do. Not a household name, not someone who sought attention. In many ways, his world and hers were entirely different places. And yet, there is something about how their story began and when that, even now, raises questions, not of scandal exactly, but of timing, of what was known, of what was said in public, and what was carefully not. Because in a relationship between two people who both understand how image is made, the silences mean something. They always do. Savannah Guthrie was not the kind of public figure who handed pieces of herself over willingly. That distinction matters more than it might sound. There are public personalities who perform intimacy, who offer just enough of themselves to create the feeling of closeness without ever actually giving anything real. And then there are people who simply keep certain things for themselves, who hold the line not out of calculation, but but out of a genuine belief that some things belonged to them alone for a long time. Guthrie appeared to be the second type. Her career was what she gave to the world, and it was, by any real measure, remarkable. The legal training that sharpened her instincts, the years of grinding through early career reporting before the bigger stages found her. When she sat across from a politician who was trying to avoid something, you could feel it, the patience, the precision, the calm willingness to let the silence grow until it had to be filled. She co-anchored alongside Matt Lauer and then Hoda Kotb, becoming one of the few true anchors of the show's modern identity. She moderated presidential debates. She reported from places where things had gone terribly wrong. She asked questions that most people wouldn't dare, and through all of it, her personal life remained largely in the background. She had spoken, in careful terms, about her faith. Raised Catholic, she has described her belief not as something performative, but as something she returns to, a foundation that shaped decisions she rarely chose to explain in full. And then there was the question of how she and Michael Feldman had come to find each other, introduced through the overlapping circles of media and political Washington, circles where certain introductions feel, in hindsight, almost inevitable. To people who understood power, who both knew the value of discretion, who had each, in their respective worlds, learned what it costs to be careless. What happened after that introduction unfolded slowly, perhaps too slowly, some later argued. For to people who were supposedly just at the beginning of something new, relationships almost never have the clean edges that public announcements suggest. The official story, when Guthrie and Feldman eventually confirmed both their relationship and their marriage, was tidy. They had met. They had fallen in love. They had built something together. That was the version that went on record. But the timeline, according to various reports, carried complications that the official version didn't fully address. Questions arose, first quietly, then with more persistence, about exactly when their relationship had begun. Specifically, whether it had been underway while Guthrie was still legally married to someone else. According to reports that circulated at the time, there was an overlap, a period in which the two things appeared to coexist, that neither party was eager to address directly or publicly. Now, it is worth being deliberate here. No official conclusion has ever been reached. No formal allegation was ever made. Relationships are human things, and they rarely follow the sequences that clean public narratives demand. None of that is being disputed, but the silence itself was striking. Here was a journalist, a woman who had built her reputation on asking the hard question and waiting for an honest answer, responding to questions about her own life with something that can only be described as a sustained, elegant deflection. She wasn't obligated to answer. That much is true, but the contrast was there, unmistakable to anyone paying close attention. Feldman said almost nothing. He was not a media figure. He owed the public no explanation, and in many ways, his silence had its own internal logic. But together their quiet became a kind of joint statement, one that said, clearly if not directly, that certain things were simply not going to be discussed. According to available reports, Guthrie had filed for divorce from her first husband around the same period that her connection to Feldman was reportedly forming. The precise sequence of events, who knew what, when feelings shifted, when decisions were made, has never been laid out in any public forum by either of them. What is confirmed is this: they married. They had children. They built a family that, from the outside, looked stable and deliberately chosen, like something constructed carefully after the harder parts were behind them. But certain questions about how it began never quite went away. They settled, instead, into the kind of low-level background noise that follows a story that hasn't been fully told. There's a performance that comes with anchoring a morning show, and not in the cynical sense. It is something closer to a sustained, daily act of emotional discipline, the ability to bring warmth to a camera at 6 in the morning, when the world around you is complicated, when things are difficult, when you are carrying something you aren't about to share. Savannah Guthrie had been doing this for years. She was, by all accounts, genuinely skilled at it. And so even as questions lingered in certain corners of the industry about the origins of her relationship with Feldman, The version of Guthrie that millions saw each morning stayed consistent, warm, steady, present. She shared her children in the careful way that good public parents do, enough to feel real, not enough to feel exploited. She spoke about faith in measured language. She walked the specific tightrope of being a woman in a very visible career who wanted to be understood as a mother, without being flattened into one dot. It was, on every visible surface, a masterclass in narrative management, but behind it, according to people who followed the story carefully, the questions persisted. Entertainment journalists, former colleagues, observers inside the industry, many had noted the ambiguity surrounding her romantic history. Some wrote about it, others held it at arm's length, letting it exist as an open question rather than something that demanded resolution. Feldman remained almost entirely invisible. No interviews, no social media presence to speak of. He had spent his professional life learning how to manage information, and he applied that same discipline, it appears, to his personal life. Together, the two of them seemed to have arrived at a shared strategy, conscious or not, that the most effective response to scrutiny was simple, consistent silence, and for a long while, that strategy held. Then 2017 arrived, and it changed the texture of everything. Matt Lauer, Guthrie's longtime co-anchor, a man she had sat beside for years, was terminated from NBC News following allegations of sexual misconduct. The news broke in the way that those revelations tend to, suddenly, with no preparation, and in full public view. Guthrie was the one who had to face America and say it out loud, live, from behind the very desk she had shared with him. What followed became one of the most watched moments in the history of morning television. She sat there visibly unsettled, and she told the truth about how she felt, that she was holding two things at once that seemed impossible to hold together: her genuine care for a colleague she had trusted, and her complete commitment to believing women who came forward. She didn't perform either one. She simply said them, and the authenticity of it landed in a way that is still talked about. But the months that followed were more complicated than that one moment. As questions inside NBC News widened, as people began asking not just about Lauer himself, but about the institutional culture that had protected him and for how long. The scrutiny inside the network deepened. People began looking more carefully at the inner workings of the institution, at who had known what and when, at what had been quietly tolerated and what had simply been overlooked. In that climate, the personal histories of people within the network became, if not officially relevant, then at least differently lit. Not accusations, not investigations, but a shift in the atmosphere, a narrowing of the tolerance for things that had simply been left unexamined. Savannah Guthrie was not implicated in any wrongdoing. That needs to be said directly. No journalist, no investigator, no colleague made any formal allegation against her of any kind. The record on that point is clear, but the environment had changed, and the questions about how her relationship with Feldman had begun, which had never fully disappeared, suddenly felt, to those who had been carrying them, slightly less easy to set aside. There is something that happens to people who spend decades being watched. It develops slowly, without announcement. It is not quite armor and not quite corruption. It is something more subtle than either, a learned ability to manage the space between who you actually are and who you allow other people to see. Some people build that skill deliberately. Others find it has simply grown up around them, like a second skin they didn't choose but can no longer imagine living without. By the time these questions were circling most visibly, Savannah Guthrie had spent the better part of 2 decades inside that kind of exposure. And there is evidence, in her interviews, in her public statements, in the way she has spoken about what she believes and what she values, that she had thought seriously about the gap between image and truth. She has spoken about the impossible standards placed on women in public life, about the way choices that go unquestioned for men get examined under an entirely different lens. When a woman makes them, that is not a dishonest observation. It is real, and it matters, but it exists alongside something else, something quieter, the recognition that Guthrie has also benefited, over the course of her career, from the particular protection that comes with occupying a powerful institutional seat. NBC News does not simply allow certain questions to go unasked by accident. Certain stories don't get written about certain people, and that is rarely a coincidence. Feldman, for his part, has remained consistently outside the frame. According to reports, he stepped back from formal political consulting after their marriage and has operated at a considerably lower profile since. He is, whether by nature or by design, someone who prefers the background, but his background, his choices, his history, the particular circumstances in which his life became entangled with hers has never been fully reckoned with in any public narrative that either of them has addressed or corrected. What to make of that, ultimately, is genuinely uncertain. It is possible, and this possibility deserves to be stated honestly, that there is very little to make of it, that the timeline questions were always overstated, that the silences were simply the private decisions of two private people who happened to share a partially public life. That is a real reading of the available evidence. It should not be dismissed, but it is also possible that the version of their story that exists in the public record is genuinely incomplete, not falsified, not constructed from nothing, but curated in the careful way that people with power and media literacy tend to curate the truths they allow the world to hold onto. And in that incompleteness, the questions remain. Not verdicts, not accusations, but questions still waiting, still unanswered, still belonging to the two people who are the only ones who truly know. There's a version of this story that resolves cleanly. Two people, a complicated beginning, a relationship that survived whatever pressures it was built under and became, in time, a family, a career that continued to grow, children, a faith that held, an image that stayed more or less intact. That version is not a lie, but it is not complete. What makes a story like this worth sitting with, worth examining without hurrying toward a conclusion, is not the possibility of scandal. It is not the gossip or the exposure or the appetite for someone else's private failures. Those things are surface. They are noise. The deeper question underneath all of it is quieter and more important than any of that. It is the question of how much we actually know about the people we invite into our mornings, our news, our understanding of what is happening in the world. It is the question of what it means to position yourself, day after day, as a voice of transparency, and to simultaneously hold back parts of your own story that the people listening to you would likely want to understand. Savannah Guthrie is, by any honest accounting, a genuinely talented journalist. Her ability to question power is real. Her composure under pressure is earned. The moment she sat at that desk in 2017 and told the truth about what she was feeling, that was not performance. That was real. But talent and accountability are not the same thing. A person can be genuinely skilled and still be capable of protecting themselves in ways that deserve a second look. A person can believe in transparency as a professional standard, as an institutional value, while quietly keeping the parts of their own life that complicate the image safely out of view. That is not hypocrisy in the simple, weaponized sense of the word. It is human. Most of us make the same kind of calculation in smaller ways, choosing which truths to offer and which ones to hold. Telling ourselves the difference is justified by privacy, by context, by the reasonable belief that some things simply belong to us. But when the person making those calculations has a platform that reaches millions, when the trust involved operates on that kind of scale, the maintenance of a carefully protected image carries a different weight, a weight that does not disappear simply because no one is pressing hard enough to make it visible. Michael Feldman, largely absent and almost entirely silent, holds a strange position in all of this. He is both central and removed, a presence that shaped the story without ever quite entering it. And that absence, sustained over so many years and through so many moments that might have invited something more, is itself a kind of answer, just not the kind that settles anything. No official conclusion has been reached about the origins of their relationship. No investigation has been opened. No formal allegation has been made. The record on all of that remains unchanged. But the questions remain too. And sometimes, the questions are the most truthful part of any story, because unlike the official version, they cannot be managed. They do not dissolve when no one acknowledges them. They simply wait, as questions always do, for the only people who can actually answer them to decide, one day, that the truth is worth more than the silence. If this story stayed with you, if something in it made you think a little longer about trust, or image, or the invisible space between what we see and what is real, take a moment and leave a thought below. What stayed with you? What question are you still holding? And if you want more stories told this way, slowly, carefully, with the weight they actually deserve, consider subscribing. There are more of them. Stories that go deeper than a headline. Stories that don't rush toward an easy ending, because the honest ones rarely have one.